The gates of Aspen Air's terminal hummed with anticipation as the final calls for passengers echoed through the loudspeakers. The smell of coffee filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of fresh pastries from the nearby kiosk. Everyone was rushing to make their way through the busy hall. But in the midst of all that chaos, there was one man who sat in the midst of it all, calm, unbothered by the growing crowd. David Blake, dressed simply in a black hoodie and worn-out jeans, was a man who didn't easily let the world dictate his pace. He was here for a quiet flight, a quick escape from the weight of meetings, paperwork, and deals. With his leather briefcase placed next to him, his eyes remained locked on the small screen of his phone, unaware that the events about to unfold would turn his life upside down. Then, a voice broke through the quiet buzz of the terminal. "Excuse me, sir. You need to move to the back." A flight attendant's voice pierced the air, loud enough to catch the attention of several nearby passengers. David looked up slowly, meeting the gaze of the woman standing before him. Her name tag read, Lena Morris. She was holding a tablet in her hands, her face stern and her posture rigid. He had barely registered the annoyance in her tone before she repeated herself. "This section is for our premium passengers only, sir. You'll need to move." His expression didn't change. The people around him seemed to hold their breath, some even sneaking glances, trying to understand what was happening. What was this all about? Why was this happening to him? "Ma'am," David began, his voice calm but with an edge of confusion. "I'm sitting in my seat 1A, first class." He reached into his pocket and retrieved his boarding pass, showing it to her. He wasn't sure why, but his heart began to race. This was his seat. His reservation. Lena glanced at the boarding pass, her brows furrowing as she looked at it more closely, her fingers tapping across the tablet screen. "This can't be right," she muttered under her breath. "Let me see your ID." Around them, the whispers started to ripple through the cabin. People were watching. A few were already taking out their phones, recording the incident. David didn't notice. His focus was on Lena, trying to figure out why she was questioning his seat, his very right to be there. Lena's hand hovered over the tablet as if trying to find some reason, some excuse to justify this bizarre confrontation. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, but the apology felt hollow. "The records show that you've only booked an economy ticket. You'll need to move to your assigned seat." David's jaw tightened as he stayed seated, still unbothered by the growing tension. "That's incorrect," he said evenly, his voice firm. "I paid for first class. I've been flying with Aspen for years." He pulled out his phone and showed her the mobile boarding pass that matched the one in his hand. It was the same. No mistake, no error. But Lena wasn't backing down. Her eyes narrowed as if she had already made up her mind about him. "That doesn't look right. There must be some kind of mistake." She gestured toward a fellow flight attendant who had been watching from the back. "Jessica, can you come over here?" Jessica stepped forward, her face unreadable. She looked over at David, sizing him up with a glance before turning back to Lena. "What's going on?" "He's in the wrong seat," Lena said quickly, her words full of doubt. "He's not supposed to be here. He must have been upgraded, by mistake." David felt a heat rising in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm not in the wrong seat. I've paid for 1A, first class. I've shown you the boarding pass, my ID, and now I've shown you my phone. You need to check your system again." His tone remained calm, but there was a steel edge to it now, a quiet authority in his voice that hadn't been there before. Lena shook her head as if she didn't believe him. "Sir, we've already checked everything. I'm afraid you'll have to move." David had been in this situation before, dealing with misunderstandings in the corporate world, facing down challenges with patience and clarity. But this was something else. It wasn't a misunderstanding, it wasn't a mistake. He could feel it. They were treating him differently, like he didn't belong here, and there it was. The reason. It wasn't about his ticket. It wasn't about a mistake. It was about him, his appearance, and the assumption that someone like him didn't belong in the front of the plane. "Sir," Lena said, her voice now almost condescending, "are you sure you didn't mean to book coach? These things happen. to people who aren't familiar with how the booking system works. A murmur swept through the passengers as they shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with what was unfolding. The camera phones were still rolling, and David felt the weight of their attention, but he wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not when he knew something wasn't right. "I'm not moving," he said softly, but firmly. "This is my seat. My seat. Not just anyone's. Mine. And I'm not leaving until you check it properly." Lena's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. Instead, she picked up her radio, signaling the captain. The tension in the cabin grew as the seconds stretched on. Then, from the front of the plane, Captain John Taylor appeared. A seasoned man, who had seen many things in his 30 years as a pilot, but nothing quite like this. He walked toward the scene, his uniform sharp, his expression hard as he glanced at the two attendants. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice loud and commanding. Lena quickly explained, her words tinged with impatience as she gestured toward David, still sitting calmly in his seat. The captain looked at David, then at Lena, and in that brief moment, David could see the instant judgment in the captain's eyes. A casual man, in casual clothes, sitting in first class? Impossible. "Son," Captain Taylor said, his voice booming with authority. "You're in the wrong seat. We can't delay the flight because of this. Please move." But David didn't move. He stayed exactly where he was, still unshaken, his eyes never leaving the captain's face. "I'm not in the wrong seat, Captain. I'm in 1A. First class. Paid for." The captain's eyes hardened. "Get up, son," he said again, his voice carrying over the murmurs from the passengers. The whole plane seemed to hold its breath. David, without a trace of fear or panic, looked up slowly at the captain and said the words that would change everything. "I'm not leaving. I paid for this seat, and I'm staying here until you check your records properly." And so, the drama began unfolding slowly, like the unraveling of a tightly wound thread. The atmosphere in the cabin was thick with anticipation. Every single eye in the room was on David, who sat quietly, unwavering, while the flight attendants, the captain, and even the other passengers seemed caught in an uncomfortable standoff. David's calmness was a stark contrast to the rising tension. It was as if he had become an immovable object, and the airline crew had turned into the forces trying to push him out of his seat. But he wasn't moving. Captain Taylor's eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation. He crossed his arms over his chest, and for a moment there was a tense silence. David knew that this wasn't just about a seat anymore. This was about something much bigger, the way people were treated based on assumptions and how those assumptions could change the course of everything. He could hear the murmurs from the passengers. Some seemed uncomfortable with the whole scene, while others had started recording on their phones. He caught a glimpse of a woman in row 3B, her camera pointed directly at him, the glow from her phone screen illuminating her face in the dim cabin light. Lena, still clutching her tablet, exchanged a brief look with Captain Taylor. There was something in her eyes, an unspoken understanding that things were escalating. "I'm afraid this is causing a delay," Captain Taylor said, his voice heavy with authority. "We can't afford to hold up the flight any longer." David stood up slowly, taking his time. The moment stretched on, every movement deliberate, his posture unyielding. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small card. Platinum status, the kind of card that promised loyalty, that guaranteed luxury on every flight. "Before you say anything," David said evenly, "let me show you something." He held the card up, and for the first time Lena glanced at it with more than a passing interest. Her eyes scanned it, then flicked back to David with an almost dismissive glance. "Anyone can get those cards online," she said, her voice cool, almost mocking. David wasn't surprised by her response. People often underestimated the value of a simple card, a symbol of years of travel, loyalty, and trust. But he wasn't just going to show her his frequent flyer status. "Not now. That wouldn't be enough. Do you know how many miles I've flown with Aspen?" David continued, his voice a little firmer. 340,000 miles. 6 consecutive years of platinum status with your airline. 3 weeks ago, I booked this seat. He placed the boarding pass on the tray table in front of him, and his eyes locked onto Lena's. And I've paid for it. The silence that followed was deafening. Lena's fingers hovered over the tablet once again, but she didn't tap it. Instead, she stared at the documents in front of her, as if waiting for them to change. Waiting for some reason to justify this, to make sense of the situation. But there was no mistake. David was right. And that's when the ripple of realization began to spread. Passengers had already begun to notice what was happening. The woman from 3B, who had been recording the entire time, raised her voice in protest. "Excuse me," she said, her tone sharp. "He showed you his boarding pass. Why aren't you checking it properly? Why are you still questioning him?" The flight attendants exchanged uncomfortable glances. The voice of dissent, once a whisper, was growing louder. "This is ridiculous," another passenger in 2A grumbled under his breath. "What's the problem? The guy has his ticket, it's clear." Lena's face flushed as she tried to maintain control over the situation, but it was slipping through her fingers. The more David remained calm, the more the passengers began to side with him. The power dynamic had shifted. The people who had been quiet observers moments ago were now part of the narrative. Captain Taylor's face was unreadable, but his posture tightened. "We're delaying the flight over this? Just move to coach, son. It's not that big of a deal." David's eyes flicked toward the captain, his gaze steady but filled with a quiet resolve. "It is a big deal," David said, his voice not loud but sharp enough for everyone in the cabin to hear. "This is about respect. It's about how I'm being treated, simply because of how I look." The words hung in the air. For a brief moment, even Captain Taylor seemed to hesitate, his rigid stance faltering. Then, as if on cue, a voice crackled over the PA system. "We're experiencing a delay due to a passenger issue," the announcement began. "Please remain seated as we resolve this matter." David wasn't sure who was more surprised, the flight attendants, the captain, or the passengers. He had expected pushback, but he hadn't expected them to realize how deeply ingrained their biases were. "Listen, we can't hold the flight up," Captain Taylor said again, this time with less conviction. His tone softened, as if he realized he wasn't just dealing with a minor inconvenience, but a man who had the power to stop everything from unfolding as planned. "Let's just get you to your seat, all right?" David paused for a beat, his eyes narrowing in thought. "Captain, you've already asked me to move once, but now you're asking me to do something different. I'm staying in my seat. 1A. First class." He let the words sink in, his voice low but unwavering. The captain's frustration was palpable. "You don't belong here," he muttered under his breath, but just loud enough for those closest to hear. David heard it, and it stung. But the sting wasn't from the words themselves, it was from the truth behind them. He knew exactly what the captain was thinking, the way he had sized him up. The assumption that David didn't belong. Not here, not in first class, not in a seat like 1A. He met the captain's gaze with unflinching resolve. "That's exactly the point," David said quietly, his voice steady but filled with quiet fire. "You don't know me. You never bothered to ask. You just assumed." The entire cabin had fallen into a tense silence again. Phones were still recording. The murmurs had died down, replaced by a kind of collective waiting, and then, as if to break the stillness, the woman from 3B spoke up again. "This is ridiculous. I've been watching for the last few minutes and I've seen everything. He's in the right seat. Why are you treating him like this?" Her voice was calm but filled with righteous anger. People were starting to agree with her. Passengers were speaking out now. The pressure was mounting, and Lena's face was turning, an alarming shade of red. "Just check his ticket," another passenger said. "What are we even doing here?" The atmosphere in the cabin was now electric. What had begun as a quiet conflict had erupted into something bigger, a confrontation about dignity, respect, and assumptions. Passengers had stopped minding their own business. They were watching now, engaging with the unfolding drama. David didn't look away from the captain. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, unyielding. He was no longer just a passenger. He was the center of a growing storm and he could feel the weight of it. Captain Taylor took a step closer, his jaw clenched. "Look, son, we can keep this up or we can just move on," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. But there was no fire behind it anymore. The harshness had ebbed away, replaced by something more subdued. The fight was no longer about the seat. It was about power, about who had the authority to dictate what was right. David knew it, and he wasn't backing down. He wasn't going to let this moment slide. "You're not hearing me, Captain," David said calmly. "I'm not asking for a free pass. I'm asking for you to do your job. Check my ticket, check my credentials. Stop making assumptions based on how I look." The captain opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the woman from 3B piped up again. "He's right," she said, her voice louder this time, gaining momentum. "I've been watching, and this is wrong. This man is being treated differently, just because of his appearance." David's heart raced with the unexpected support. The others around him, who had remained silent for so long, now found their voices. There was a quiet chorus of agreement, small murmurs of dissent and disbelief. People were speaking up now, no longer content to let the injustice slide under the radar. "You're embarrassing yourself," a businessman in 4A said, glancing up from his laptop, his voice filled with quiet anger. "This isn't how you treat paying customers. You've checked his ID. He's not lying." Lena's face flushed red, and her fingers tightened around the tablet. The weight of the situation was beginning to settle on her too. The passengers around her weren't just bystanders, they were a crowd, and they were starting to take sides. She had miscalculated, and now she was losing control. "I've asked you politely to move," Lena said, her voice shaking. "Now, I'm telling you, please, move to your seat. This is going too far." She was barely holding it together. David shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I'm not moving." His voice was steady, but underneath it was a quiet fury. He had endured enough. The unspoken biases, the assumptions, the mistreatment, it all came to a head in that moment. And then, almost as if summoned by the rising tension, a man in the back of the plane stood up. He was older, his hair silvered at the temples, but his voice was clear and firm. "This is ridiculous," he said, stepping forward. "I've been watching this whole thing. That man is right. This is discrimination. I've been flying for 30 years and I've never seen anything like this." David turned toward the man, his eyes widening slightly. He hadn't expected to hear that, but it was exactly what he needed to hear. The elderly man nodded at him, and then turned to face the flight crew. "You've all made a mistake and you need to fix it." Lena looked flustered, her hands trembling as she glanced between David and the man. "Sir, this is none of your business," she said, trying to assert some semblance of control, but the words fell flat. David's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. His instincts told him to stay calm, to control the room with his presence. He looked back at Captain Taylor. "You're the captain, right?" he asked. "What's it going to be? Are you going to keep this going, or are you going to do the right thing and check my ticket?" The captain hesitated for a moment, his gaze flicking between David and the growing crowd of onlookers. He sighed heavily, clearly frustrated but now unsure of how to proceed. There was something different in his posture, an understanding that had shifted in that very moment. He turned to Lena. "Check the system again, and this time do it properly." Lena's fingers flew across the tablet, typing quickly as the room fell into a tense silence. The seconds stretched on like hours. David held his breath, his thoughts racing. This wasn't just about a flight anymore. It was about making sure that no one else had to go through what he was going through. It was about standing up, even when the odds were stacked against you. Finally, Lena let out a small, almost defeated sigh. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice suddenly small. "It appears there was a mistake. You are in the correct seat." David didn't respond immediately. He let the words hang in the air, allowing the weight of them to sink in. He looked around at the other passengers who were now watching him with a mix of relief and respect. They knew what had just happened. They had witnessed the tipping point, the moment when everything changed. David stood up, grabbed his briefcase, and with a calm but deliberate motion, settled back into his seat in 1A. He didn't need to say anything more. The truth had already spoken for itself, but just as the tension began to dissipate, Captain Taylor stepped forward once more, his voice carrying across the cabin. "Sir," he began, his tone more measured now. "I apologize for the misunderstanding. I was mistaken." David looked up at him, his expression unflinching. "It's not just about this moment, Captain. It's about what happens next. People need to understand that no one should be treated like this. Not on a plane, not anywhere." The captain nodded slowly, but David could see it in his eyes. The uncomfortable realization that this wasn't just a simple mix-up. It was a systemic issue, one that extended far beyond the walls of Aspen Air's first-class cabin. Just then, the woman in 3B, who had been quietly observing the entire situation, stood up. She walked toward the front of the cabin, her phone in hand, and addressed the crew. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice cutting through the air, "but this needs to be reported. This isn't just a personal issue anymore. This is about the way people of color are treated when they travel." The cabin went silent again. For a moment, David wasn't sure if anyone would back her up. But as the seconds ticked by, the murmurs began again, growing louder, this time with more resolve. The woman continued, "This is bigger than one person. It's bigger than one flight." David sat back in his seat, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. The tension that had once been thick, almost suffocating, now hung like a dense fog over the cabin. The words from the woman in 3B still echoed in his mind. This was bigger than one mistake. It was bigger than just a seat on a plane. It was about how society treated people based on assumptions. His eyes scanned the cabin. The passengers who had once been passive observers now seemed to hold their breath, waiting for something to happen next. Some were still recording on their phones, but there was a sense of unity in the air, a collective recognition that they were all witnessing something important, something that could and should change. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blake," Captain Taylor said, his voice now more composed. He didn't seem as sure of himself as before, no longer carrying the same air of authority. "I truly didn't mean for this to go as far as it did." David didn't respond immediately. His eyes were locked on the captain, but it wasn't a look of anger. It was one of quiet resolve. "It's not just you, Captain," David said, his voice carrying across the cabin. "It's all of you. It's the system. You made assumptions. You treated me like I didn't belong here. And that's the real issue." There was a long pause. Captain Taylor's face flushed as he glanced down at the floor, clearly uncomfortable with the weight of David's words. In the silence, the woman, in 3B, Dr. Laura Jenkins, stepped forward again. She had been quiet for a moment, but now her voice cut through the hushed cabin. "What Mr. Blake said is the truth. I've been flying for years, and I've seen people treated differently just because of their appearance. This isn't the first time I've witnessed something like this, and I know it won't be the last if we don't speak up." David turned to her, surprised by her words. Her voice wasn't just firm, it was filled with a quiet, steady conviction. She wasn't just defending him. She was speaking up for what was right. He could see it now. The moment wasn't just about him, it was about all of them. Around the cabin, more heads began to turn. Passengers shifted in their seats, some nodding in agreement. The woman in 3B wasn't alone anymore. Slowly, one by one, other passengers started to speak up, sharing their own frustrations, their own stories. It was as if a dam had broken, and the flood of support couldn't be contained. "This is how it starts," one passenger in row 4 said, his voice full of emotion. "One mistake, one incident, and the whole system is exposed. We're all complicit. If we don't stand up." David felt the tide turn. He was no longer the lone voice in the storm. The cabin had shifted. The passengers had taken a stand, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever felt marginalized or overlooked. Lena stood off to the side, her expression faltering as she heard the mounting voices of dissent. She glanced at the captain, but it was clear to both of them that the situation was spiraling beyond their control. This wasn't just about seating assignments anymore. This was about accountability. "I can't believe this is happening," the elderly man in 2A said, shaking his head. "The way you treated him. It's shameful. This isn't how any passenger should be treated. You don't even know this, man, but you assume the worst." David took a deep breath. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but it wasn't a burden anymore. It was a fire that burned brightly with purpose. He knew this wasn't just about making a scene. This was about making a point that needed to be heard, a point that needed to be felt. "We're not just standing up for one person," David said, his voice clear and strong. "We're standing up for all the people who have been made to feel like they don't belong simply because of who they are. This isn't just about a seat on a plane. This is about the way we all deserve to be treated with dignity, with respect." The cabin fell into a heavy silence again, but this time, it was a silence filled with respect, not tension. Dr. Jenkins stepped forward and addressed the captain once more, her tone firm but kind. "I think we've made our point, Captain," she said. "Now what are you going to do about it?" Captain Taylor swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the passengers who had gathered near the front, their phones still recording. He seemed to shrink under their gaze, and for the first time, it was clear that the situation had shifted. The power had moved from the flight crew to the passengers, and they weren't going to let this slide. Lena shifted on her feet, looking down at her tablet, clearly at a loss for words. The realization that she had failed to recognize David's rights and the consequences of her actions began to sink in. David met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. "What happens next, Lena, is up to you. You have a choice. You can either let this moment be a lesson, or you can choose to ignore it. But either way, it's going to change things." Her shoulders sagged, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of acknowledgement in her eyes, a glimpse of understanding that this wasn't just about being right. It was about doing the right thing. Captain Taylor cleared his throat, his voice quieter now. "I'll report the incident," he said, his words measured, "and we'll make sure this doesn't happen again, but I want to make it clear, we're not going to tolerate any further disruption." David nodded, though the fight was far from over. "I don't want to hear that again. If you're going to fix this, you need to go deeper than words. You need to make sure that everyone, every single person on this plane, in this airline, is treated with respect. Not just the people in first class, not just the ones who have the right documents, but everyone." Captain Taylor didn't respond right away, but David could see it now, the shift in his posture, the change in his attitude. He understood, and perhaps for the first time, he truly saw the full weight of the situation. As the conversation continued, the cabin gradually returned to a simmering calm. The passengers began to settle back into their seats, but the energy had shifted. The air was thick with anticipation, and for the first time everyone knew that this wasn't just an incident that would fade away. This was a turning point. David leaned back in his seat, his mind still racing with the implications of what had just unfolded. He had taken a stand, but more than that, the whole plane had taken a stand with him. It wasn't just about one person's rights. It was about the power of a collective voice, a unified call for justice. The flight was still delayed, but David didn't mind. He knew that sometimes the greatest battles weren't won in the air. They were won on the ground, in moments like this one. The plane sat still at the gate, the hum of the air conditioning the only sound that seemed to fill the space now. The tension, which had once felt so tight it could snap at any moment, had started to wane, replaced by a heavier, quieter kind of anticipation. Passengers were still recording, but now they weren't just documenting. They were witnesses to something unfolding in real time. David leaned back in his seat, his fingers drumming on the armrest, his mind racing. He could feel the eyes of the passengers on him, but he didn't flinch. They had seen what had happened, and they had chosen their side. Now it was time for the airline to show that they would do more than just apologize. "Sir, Captain," Taylor's voice broke through the quiet. "I've spoken to the ground crew. They're working on fixing the mistake. This won't happen again." David turned to face the captain, his gaze calm but unwavering. "You're right, it won't," he said. But saying it won't make it true. You need to show it, not just here, but in how your crew operates from now on. The captain paused, his face tightening as if the words had struck him harder than he had anticipated. For the first time, David saw a flicker of understanding in the captain's eyes. The air wasn't just thick with tension anymore. It was filled with the gravity of what had just been acknowledged. "I'll take care of it," Captain Taylor said, his voice low. "We'll take your concerns seriously. I'll make sure this gets reported and that action is taken." David didn't respond right away. He didn't need to. The apology, even though it had come late, was a start. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Then Dr. Jenkins, the woman from 3B, spoke up once more, her voice carrying the same determination that had guided her from the beginning. "What happens now?" she asked, her eyes focused on David. "Are they going to sweep this under the rug? What are you going to do about it?" David looked around the cabin, the once quiet faces now filled with silent expectation. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every passenger who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or treated unfairly. He needed to make sure this moment wasn't wasted. He stood up from his seat and walked toward the front of the cabin, his presence commanding attention. "This isn't just about fixing a mistake in the seating chart. This is about changing the system," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's about making sure that the people who work here, who represent the airline, understand that their actions have consequences, that they can't make assumptions based on how people look. Not in a restaurant, not in a store, and certainly not on a flight." The passengers listened intently, the weight of David's words sinking in. The people who had been recording earlier now had their phones down, no longer just passive bystanders. They were becoming part of the solution. David turned back to the crew, his eyes locking with Lena's. She hadn't said much since the captain had apologized, but the look on her face told him everything he needed to know. She was beginning to realize the enormity of what had just transpired. "I'm not asking for an apology, Lena," David continued, his voice still steady. "I'm asking for accountability. This doesn't end when we take off. This ends when we see real change. You need to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. You need to make sure that the next time someone like me is in a seat like this, they aren't treated like they don't belong here." Lena nodded slowly, her expression a mixture of frustration and something else, something more thoughtful, perhaps even remorseful. It was clear now that she understood the severity of her actions. She had failed in her duty as a flight attendant, and now she had to face the consequences. The cabin was still quiet, but there was a sense of unity in the air. Passengers exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, others simply watching in awe as David took control of the moment. They weren't just bystanders anymore, they were part of a movement, and they understood that. Suddenly, David's phone buzzed in his pocket, interrupting the stillness. He pulled it out and saw a message flash across the screen. "Emergency board meeting, Chen Industries. You're needed immediately." David glanced at the message and a small smile tugged at his lips. He had known this moment was coming. The moment when everything would shift, when the system would start to respond. Not just because of his words, but because of his influence. But now was not the time to back down. He looked at the captain, then at Lena, his voice now resolute. "I'm going to make sure that this airline doesn't just hear what happened. I'm going to make sure they feel it. Every single person on this flight, every person in this terminal, and every person who watches this unfold will understand that this is a line in the sand. The change starts now." The captain nodded again, this time with a quiet sense of resolve. He could see it now, the importance of David's words, the significance of this moment. It wasn't just about getting from point A to point B anymore. It was about something bigger than that. The passengers began to stir, the hum of their voices rising again, but this time it was different. There was a sense of purpose, a shared understanding that something important was happening, and they had all witnessed it together. This wasn't a moment to let pass quietly. David returned to his seat, his mind still racing with the implications of what had just occurred. He could feel the change in the air. He had started something, and it was only going to grow from here, and Then, as if on cue, the announcement came over the loudspeaker once more. Ladies and gentlemen, we've resolved the issue. We apologize for the delay. Flight 226 is now ready for departure. Please sit back and relax. David looked out the window, his eyes scanning the vast sky. The world was still, but inside, things had shifted. He knew the fight wasn't over. It had just begun. The engines roared to life, the deep hum vibrating through the plane as it slowly taxied toward the runway. But for David, the flight was already long over. The real journey had begun the moment he stood his ground in 1A. The Mao plane was still in chaos, but it was a different kind of chaos now. The kind that came with the realization that things were changing. The kind that came with the understanding that the ground had shifted beneath their feet. As the passengers settled into their seats, the quiet buzz of conversations and the occasional click of phone screens filled the cabin. This wasn't just a flight anymore, it was a stage for something much bigger. David leaned back in his seat, his mind racing through the events that had unfolded so far. It wasn't just about getting the apology from the flight crew anymore. It was about what came next. It was about ensuring that his moment, this pivotal, explosive moment, didn't fade into the background. He glanced around the cabin. Passengers who had previously been bystanders were now looking at him with new respect. Some had put their phones down, their recordings replaced with quiet nods. Others were still texting, their eyes occasionally flicking up to meet his, as if trying to gauge his next move. As the plane made its way down the runway, David couldn't shake the sense that this was only the beginning. He had made his stand, but now he had to make sure it didn't stop with him. The seatbelt sign blinked off and the captain's voice crackled over the loudspeaker, announcing that they had reached cruising altitude. But this wasn't just an announcement for the passengers. It was a final call, a call for them to recognize the power they had, the power they all held when they stood together against injustice. David didn't wait long before standing again. The moment he rose from his seat, the eyes of the cabin followed. The passengers, once passive, now seemed eager to see what he would do next. The quiet tension in the air was palpable, and for a moment, it was as if the whole world had stopped to listen. He made his way down the aisle, his steps steady and purposeful. When he reached the front of the plane, he didn't speak right away. Instead, he turned to face the cabin, looking over the faces that had witnessed everything. The passengers in first class, in coach, everyone. This was their moment too. "Want to thank you all for standing with me," David said, his voice carrying throughout the cabin. "What happened today, what you saw, was not just a mistake. It was a system, a way of thinking that people like me have had to fight against for years. It was a moment where people made assumptions based on the color of my skin, based on how I look. And it didn't just affect me, it affects all of us." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle in. He could feel their eyes on him. They weren't just listening. They were understanding. "But today," he continued, his voice stronger now, "we did something about it. Today we showed that when we stand together, we can make a difference. We can challenge the systems that hold us back and fight for the respect we all deserve." A murmur of approval rippled through the cabin, quiet at first but growing louder. David didn't stop. "I'm not done here. Not by a long shot. But this is a start. This is the moment that changes things." He turned to face Captain Taylor, who had been watching him intently from the front of the plane. The captain's face had softened, his earlier frustration replaced with a weary acceptance. "I hope," David said, locking eyes with the captain, "you remember this moment. You remember what it feels like to treat people with respect. I hope that this moment stays with you, because it's not just about me. It's about every person who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. Every person who's been judged based on how they look. This has to change. And it will." The captain nodded slowly, a subtle sign of acknowledgement that David's words had cut through the noise, had made an impact. David stepped back toward his seat, the murmurs of approval still echoing through the cabin. The flight attendants, once steadfast in their roles, were now visibly shaken. They had seen the shift too. It wasn't just a shift in the passengers, It was a shift in the way they saw the world, and as the plane ascended into the sky, the air felt different, lighter. Not because the flight was smoother, but because the air in the cabin had shifted. The passengers had been changed. David had changed them. The journey, however, wasn't over. Not for David, and not for the people he had just left behind. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning.